Shakespeare in America, most people's first mental picture isn't native peoples. Why not? If you think of Shakespeare in any other country, your mind draws an image that combines the peoples of that land and Shakespeare. But here, native peoples have historically been erased from the theater narrative, while Shakespeare has been touted as its epitome. British culture is mythologized as our theatrical heritage, and Shakespeare is the most produced playwright on these shores. His plays are widely taught in US schools, and for hundreds of years, native students have been required to engage with Shakespeare. Meanwhile, the American government made native arts illegal for long periods of history. None of this is by accident, of course. Shakespeare's work is used as a part of colonizing systems on these lands. Native people have as much right to interpret Shakespeare through their cultures as anyone else. Putting so much value on a single artist's work is dangerous, when we could have many voices that represent all of us in the circle. Shakespeare is at its best when everyone is allowed to decide what interests them and how they interpret it through their own perspectives. Many native artists have found ways to reimagine Shakespeare, bridging communities to illustrate the importance of Indigenous language revitalization, native arts, and storytelling. Here are a few examples. 1923. Amidst the residential school system that was taking native children from their homes and forcing them to attend boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their own languages, there is a story of possibility. At Haskell Indian School in 1923, two native teachers, Ella Deloria and Ruth Muskrat Bronson, put on a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream with the students. Esther Horn, who played Hermia in that production, wrote that her teachers had the unique ability to weave native culture into the non-native curriculum, empowering her students and their cultures. In 2004, Tlingit Macbeth, produced by Perseverance Theatre and Sealaska Heritage in Juneau, was directed by a non-native but had an all-Alaska Native cast, artists and translators weaving Tlingit language, song, dance, and philosophy into the production. It was spoken in both Tlingit and English, with the English being used for moments in which characters behaved more ambitious and individualistic instead of focusing on community. Since then, Perseverance has produced many Tlingit plays by Tlingit playwrights with native directors and designers. 2012. Grappling with language loss and reclamation in New York City, I directed my first production, set in my people's northeastern homelands, centered on the post-colonial reimagining, What If Caliban got his language back? This production of The Tempest began with a prologue in Mohegan spoken by Ariel, setting up the play as a story of something that happened a long time ago, with the settlers leaving at the end of the play, leaving us our world and the need to heal it. Unlike Tlingit, which still has elders who are fluent speakers, my Mohegan Nation lost our last fluent speaker in the early 1900s, so our language revitalization project could not yet translate a whole play. But beginning with a Mohegan prologue allowed me to imagine an alternative world without colonizers here, a world in which our language was used once more. At the same time, in 2012, the only American representation in the World Shakespeare Festival in London was a production performed by white actors in redface. Major funding was still going toward white performers embodying stereotypes of native peoples, instead of going toward native artists. In 2013, while touring Shakespeare to native villages in Alaska, the Fairbanks Shakespeare Theatre was asked, "Why aren't you telling our stories?" So, with Gwich'in artist Alan Hayton, who also worked on Tlingit Macbeth, they co-conceived a new Gwich'in production of King Lear, Lear Kekwe, reimagining Lear in 1800s Alaska. He played the role of Lear as an elder concerned about what's being passed down to the next generation. In 2015, they also did a production of Midsummer Night's Dream, which included Gwich'in, Tlingit, and Yupik languages. 2015, the Instead of Redface movement launched in response to several major redface productions, which was still at that point the dominant representation of Native people in American stages. Native Voices at the Autry in LA produced Randy Reinholtz's adaptation of Measure for Measure, Off the Rails that year, set in the Indian boarding school system, examining the horrors and corruption of those spaces. In 2017, Off the Rails became the first Native play produced at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, opening a path for more Native plays to be produced in the future seasons. From 2014 to 2016, the Native Shakespeare Ensemble at Amarinda, American Indian Artists, Inc. created two urban Indian productions. First, a production of Macbeth, where the witches represented colonialism. The play also questioned what it meant for Macbeth to drop the eagle feather, failing the good leadership Duncan wanted to pass down. The second was The Winter's Tale, examining intergenerationality, Indigenous futurism, matriarchy, extraction, and the role of the seasons. In 2019 and 2021, the South Dakota Shakespeare Festival had Native directors lead their productions of Midsummer and Othello, actively recruiting Native actors from many nations, who also led workshops in the community. Director Tara Moses adapted Othello to exist in a world post full Indigenous sovereignty and full Black liberation, but where the lingering effects of colorism in society still had to be grappled with. In 2022, Yasona Caper, a graduate student in the University of Hawaii at Manoa's graduate program in Hawaiian theater, recently adapted Twelfth Night into Hawaiian, and also created a new work that explores the intersection between Julius Caesar and Hawaii's political landscape during the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. Whether including Indigenous languages or adapting works to include a Native writer's voice in English, these Shakespeare productions can only be built in Native-empowered spaces. Despite the original colonial intentions that forced Shakespeare on Native peoples, these productions say, our languages are equal to or more complicated than Shakespeare's. There's more to these stories when they are put in conversation with ours. Often, when Native-centered reimaginings of Shakespeare's plays are produced and performed, it makes theaters want to learn more about Native stories, and they're more likely to produce Native plays in future seasons. Applying Indigenous philosophies to Shakespeare's works has changed the future of theater and made space for a wider spectrum of Native theater across the nation. In performance today, what's most important is not what the text meant hundreds of years ago, but what it means to the communities who interact with it now.